podcast sponsored by the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. I'm Beth.
And I'm Ava, and on Minds Matter, we explore research from neuroscience to psychology, while occasionally talking about our own personal experiences.
And this week on the podcast, I spoke to Dr. Oded Bein, who is a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University. He looks at memory and learning and how we organise information in the brain and how these processes might be different for people with anxiety. And Oded is actually a good friend of mine. I met him at a conference last year and we got to record this podcast in person in New York, which was kind of special and exciting. And make sure you stay till the end because we'll give some tips on how you can improve your memory. I hope you guys enjoy.
I'm Oded and I study learning and memory, so how we learn new things and how we remember, how memory works and how the brain helps us to do this. And I study how these things change with different mental health concerns.
One of the things that you're interested in is how knowledge is organized in the mind.
Right. Yeah.
Can you explain to the audience how we can think about this and maybe some examples? Because I think it's really interesting, but if you haven't thought about that before, like, oh, wait, knowledge is organized in the brain in some way? Like, what does that mean?
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what I find really fascinating. So, it's like our memories are not all smushed together.
Mm-hmm.
That's the basic thing. But our brain has a way of kind of making order in all of that. Not all memories are the same. We have different types of memories. So, for example, we have semantic memory, which is more about like facts, like the capital of France is Paris.
Yeah.
And then we have episodic memories. I remember the time that I was in France, or like I was in Paris, and I went to the Eiffel, and it was so fun. I was there with my mom, like everything was great. So episodic memories, almost by definition, they have a specific time and place that happen. It's like memories for events. Mm-hmm. I think when people think about memory, that's like mostly what they think about. But this is just like one type of them. So if we talk about just like semantic and episodic memories, this is also already one way of seeing how not all memories are the same. Even within that, memories are organized in ways like, for example, in our semantic memory, we have categories. Yeah. Right? Like we know like what dogs are, and dogs are not cats, and that is represented differently in the brain. So categories are one way of organizing knowledge, and in episodic memories, it's the same. One thing that I find really exciting is that our memories are not copies of the past. So if I ask you, tell me about a party you went to last week, or tell me about like your 8th birthday or whatever, it's not like you pull out a video of that event and telling me about it. It's really our brain like reconstruct that as you retrieve the information, as you tell me about it. And this memory in your brain, since, it's been like 10 years, this memory has changed. It's called consolidation. It's this period of time and ongoing, and memories are being integrated together. Memories are being separated from one another. Like our brain pulls them apart to be very different so we don't confuse them. All of these things are really important and are ways in which our brain really help us to organize our memories. And these are the processes that I really care about and I'm really fascinated by.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So if you're having your memory of going to France with your mum, so that's your episodic memory. Yeah. And then you have your semantic memory, so what Paris is.
Yeah.
If you're recalling the episodic memory, would that like go to your semantic do they communicate?
Yeah. Yes. It's a great question. So we talk about this like different types of memory, but all of these different systems interact all the time. Mm-hmm. Even now when we talk, like language is a type of semantic knowledge, like the meaning of the words. Right? We use it when we retrieve episodic memories. There's always an interaction, and it's the thinking as, I mentioned about this like reconstruction process that is happening when we retrieve an episodic memory, like the time that I visited in France. The thinking is that our brain pulls information from different sources. One of it is a semantic knowledge. One of it is like this episodic memory that actually happened. It could be also other episodic memories. Mm-hmm. And it pulls all of it together to make like one coherent story. Cool. So yeah, these systems totally interact. It's one way in which they interact when we retrieve a memory, but it also happens already during encoding. So for example, we remember differently things that are more congruent with our semantic knowledge than things that are surprising and are incongruent with our prior knowledge. Different brain systems are involved because you need to do different things with this information, probably. Yeah. Things that are related to prior knowledge. If I tell you Madonna has a new album, or Taylor Swift, I need to update my references. It's like when I was a teenager. But yeah, so if I tell you that, you remember it differently than if I tell you about a random singer that I like and you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
So yeah, these systems definitely interact. They influence, the brain works differently, and they interact in very interesting ways.
So some of your work has looked at segmentation in anxiety. Can you explain what segmentation is?
Yeah. So as we go through our lives, our experience is always continuous, right? There's no breaks, there's no stops. But what is going on online is that our brain actually chunks our experience to events. And that happens when the situation changes. So for example, we just had brunch and we left the restaurant, and that's a big context. This huge shift is a point for our brain to start to initiate a lot of processes that are basically saying, okay, that episode is now ended, encapsulated, create memories, start consolidate, and start a new event model, start a new representation, basically. And that has been studied a lot during both perception as well as in memory later on. So not just what's going on online, but also how do these processes influence how we remember things. So for example, we know it's easier to remember the order of things when they happen in the same context, the same event, compared to if they happen in two different events. Our brain is doing it constantly.
So we have these context shifts and then we segment, like that's the
Yeah.
event. Is that something that we learn how to do? So when we're born, I'm not sure, but I would assume a baby wouldn't know, okay, well, this is a context. Is that a process that we learn or we don't really know?
It's a fascinating question. I think people are starting to study it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have the answer yet. I would assume event segmentation is, I would say it's like an umbrella for multiple processes, right?
Yeah.
There is like this shift of context. It's a spike in arousal, we think. Some people say there's like a prediction or a signal there, because some people say like it's like the stability of the environment all of a sudden changes. And that starts a whole line of processes, like removing the working memory event. The model, the representation you just had is now no longer in working memory. You need to start a new one. The whole slew of processes.
Yeah.
If I have to hypothesize, I think potentially some of the more like arousal potential mechanisms, we might not need to learn these.
Yeah.
But the process of like, oh, that's a good cue for us to chunk, to like think about scissors for like, that's a good cue to now cut our memories and separate representations. That might be learned.
Yeah.
It might be learned with time. You learn that if I now moved from a park to like a street, it's good for me to now not keep all this information about what happened in a park and attend, because now I need to watch cars.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't need to do it before.
Yeah.
So I think that might be learned, that part. I don't know if like the spike of attention, shift, prediction, or arousal signals that happen, that might be not learned. But I don't know.
That's super interesting. It's cool. It's also funny thinking about your memories when you're speaking about this, and I'm thinking about, it's like, oh, wait, yeah, they are in these blocks of things. And if you don't know that already, it's not something I've ever really thought about.
Yeah. We just, live our lives
just
remembering things, but with others, we don't really
think about what's going on.
Yeah.
So then what is the relationship between this segmentation process and mental illness?
So we think about these like events that we create, these little like context models that we have as like building blocks for all of our knowledge and our memories. And you can think about mental health, or in my research, I think about mental health as aberrations or changes of our mental models of the world. And in the learning processes and how we infer based on them, all of these change in mental health, either accompanying and potentially maintaining, or in creating the situation to begin with.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we think about anxiety and we think about treatments for anxiety, so currently one of the most common treatments for anxiety is exposure therapy. And in exposure therapy, what we want to do in exposure therapy is basically like, it's called extinct the fear. Lenin-Ko's infant theory it's a computational theory that has some explanation for how this works. So according to latent cause inference, it's a computational theory of how we group observations in the environment into clusters. These are like the latent causes. And these clusters in our story so far, in our example so far, they can be like a context, right? I know this second and this second and this second, these are all a part of the branch event. And then there's a switch, and I know like, okay, now this is a new cluster. In latent cause inference, they use Bayesian inference to understand what observations goes to which clusters. The cool thing is, or the interesting aspect, is that then we use these clusters to learn about them as well. So the phenomenology of anxiety is excessive fear. We are afraid in situations that we shouldn't be afraid. One potential cause for that is if you don't separate well the different causes or the different contexts. So all parks are the same, and therefore if you had one terrible experience in a park, now all parks are fearful. Or all public places are fearful. You can think about it as overgeneralization of fear. And as not segmenting well. Right? Everything then lumps into this one big context that then becomes really intimidating.
That's so interesting. I was thinking if you have a fear of sharks, which, maybe you should have a fear of sharks.
Yeah, you should.
But then if you then have a fear of all ocean, so, there could be, it's like, oh, well, there's some oceans that do have sharks. You don't want to swim in those, but there's other, like the bay, you'll be fine. But then you're afraid of that. Maybe the beach in general.
Or like I never go to the beach because there are sharks. And then you're like, it's, the Mediterranean. You're fine.
You'd be fine.
Also, you're on the beach. You're not in the water. Like that's. Yes.
Oh, that's so interesting because of that segmentation.
Yes.
That's
so,
really cool.
it's a theory. We don't know yet.
Yeah, okay.
The other aspect, coming from the same theory, is that, and that might be less intuitive, is that if you separate contexts very well, that also prevents learning. So let's say you had a terrible experience in a park, and then you're creating this latent cause or this cluster context of like dangerous park context. Then you go again to a park, you have a pleasant experience, everything is fine. You create another, and you segment very well, you create another context and being like, oh, that one is from the safe parks. What happens later on is that every time you go to another park, let's say you continue going to parks, if you go and you have a good experience, you're like, well, this one was from the safe parks context. But that means that the memory of the dangerous park is unchanged, and it can evoke fear every time because the next park might be from the dangerous parks. So you never update because you created these distinct memories. It's too distinct. It's separated. So you don't update the dangerous one.
Oh, that's so interesting. So the two examples are kind of the opposite.
The two examples
of the segmentation and anxiety.
So we did a study in which we wanted to ask, okay, which one is it? Are they overgeneralizing or are they segmenting very well? Because if you think about how you would design exposure therapy, you would design it very different based on whether it's one or the other. So what we did in our study, we actually did two different tasks, like one big study, but two different tasks. And in one of them, we let people read stories. And when people read stories sentence by sentence, sentences that have a change of context, by the way, these are called event boundaries. These sentences that have a change of context or an event boundary, people read them slower, which could be like a cost of switching our mental model of the world. So we used that to look at boundary processing. And we saw that people that reported higher symptoms of anxiety actually took longer to respond to boundaries. So everybody responded longer, but people with anxiety even more so. So that already suggested, okay, something here is changing. Something else is going on here with people with anxiety in the boundaries, and that can influence how they segment things. But you're like, well, they respond slower. Or is it because of an impairment? Or is it because of hypersensitivity to boundaries? And then that might result in better segmentation. So we did another study, and that also is a task that has been used a lot in event segmentation, where people watch movies or movie clips. In our study it was movie clips. And they have to say, when do you think the context changes? When in your mind does the situation ends? And you can look at like the group average segmentation, and we take that as a kind of measure of what is like a precise segmentation. So where most people think a boundary is, that's probably a good place to put a boundary, to segment events. And this measure in the past has been linked to better memory of events. So we know it is adaptive to be similar to the group norm, to be what we call like typical segmenter. So we use that measure. We can estimate for each participant how similar they are to the norm. And the more similar they are, we call them a more typical segmenter. And we saw that people with anxiety, so again, people that reported higher levels of anxiety symptoms, are more typical. They are more similar to the norm, which we interpret as being more precise segmenters, presumably better in separating events. It's not like they segment events more or less. They don't produce more chunks or less chunks than people without anxiety, but they put them in the correct places. So they're actually really good in segmenting context.
That's really, really interesting. So if this is the case for exposure therapy or therapies to treat this, what would that look like?
Yeah, so this is it's a tough thing to overcome, but luckily we know about things that can help us to integrate memories. So reminders can be very helpful. So if you're in one context, but then actually you remind people of the other context, your brain might integrate these experiences together.
Okay.
That's one way of doing it. Now, it might be hard or even counterintuitive in an anxiety therapy. Like we're trying to do is to extinct the fear while you're reminding people of the fearful memory. And also like with some phobias, for example, it can be really hard to do. So I'm not saying it's like a perfect solution, but reminders generally are a good way to bridge memories.
Yeah.
Because you are creating one memory, but in that there's also the information from the other one. And then our brain kind of integrates them together. Another way that has been shown, not in exposure therapy, I think, but in basic science studies is, so generally, like for example, in an extinction paradigm, which is the basic science paradigm that mimics exposure therapy. Usually what happens is that people learn some aversive experience, like for example, that if they see a blue square on the screen, there is going to be a shock coming afterwards or an unpleasant sound or something, and some aversive experience. And people learn it and start being afraid of the blue square, which is the good response. Yeah. And then afterwards you do extinction. You show the blue square again, and this time it's not followed by a shock. And with time people learn like, okay, we're good. Yeah. That has been, when you do that, when you stop the shock very abruptly, that can make people create two different memories. There is like the learning memory, and then you're saying, okay, now I'm in a new context where the blue square is not aversive anymore. Yeah. But when they come a day later, we see spontaneous recovery of fear. Okay. So people come again and are like, okay, well, now I'm in a new situation. In which one am I? Yeah. Am I in the fearful one? Some people are expecting shock again or expecting some aversive response when they see the blue square. So you asked me how to mitigate that. When you do what's called gradual extinction, so you actually interleave shocks with no shocks in the beginning of the extinction part, people update better. It takes a bit longer, but you see less of the spontaneous recovery of fear later. Okay. Because people actually integrated the experience together and they were like, oh, it's not a new experience. It's that blue square that is now not fearful. So again, a little counterintuitive because they're like, but they saw more shocks. Yeah. Why is that happening? But we think it's because of this separation of latent causes or of context, of memories versus integrating.
That's so interesting. Because I was thinking if I was doing the blue square experiment and I was shocked and then I wasn't shocked and then I did it the next day, I would be shocked.
There you go. Yeah, like you're not alone.
I would be prepared to be shocked.
And it is an adaptive response.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Because if there is a chance that, this tiger is coming at you, you don't want to take that chance. No. You're ending up. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So now we're going to talk about some of your other research. So can you explain what a schema is in relationship to learning?
That's a really, really great question. So a schema, or the way we think about schema, is knowledge of what typically happens in the world. Typically happens in a context like a schema of a restaurant. Usually you go, You see a host, you go and you sit in a table, there's menus, all the things we know that happen in restaurants. This is like a schema of what happens in a restaurant. It can be like a schema of like what happens in an airport, a schema of many different things. In psychotherapy, by the way, or in development as well, this term has many different meanings in different areas of psychology. But in therapy, many times like a schema can be a schema of yourself, like how you perceive yourself, or like people can have schemas of relationships, like they had some model of very formative relationship, and now that's just schema of how relationships go, and they like duplicate. So that's might be a little bit different. And the really interesting thing is that schemas, we both learn them through experience. So with more and more visits to a restaurant, you kind of build your schema of what typically happens versus like what can be unique. Like, you know, the fact that like now when we had brunch, you ordered your ode to NJ Farmers. That's not a part of your schema. That's like it happened once.
Yeah.
But the other repeating typical things, that's what's going to be a part of your schema. The interesting part, and I kind of talked about it a little bit before, is that also then guides our perception and our memory, because schemas include predictions of what's going to happen next. As you're in a restaurant and you're seated, you're like, okay, the menu is coming. Or like you order and then you expect the food to arrive at some point. And that's all based on your schema of what happens in a restaurant. You know that's how it should happen. Yeah. If things happen in a different way, then you're surprised. So our schemas really guide like our perception, predictions that we make, our behavior in a certain place. We know what is the appropriate behavior in restaurants versus, for example, if you're like in a party in someone's apartment, like you're not behaving the same. Yeah, so it's both. We both learn them through experience, but then they guide experience as well, and memory later on.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You've looked at how reinforcement learning can help us understand how we learn schemas. Yes. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So even though schemas are very ubiquitous, like people study them, they're very interested in them, both in psychology and in neuroscience in the last like 2 decades or so, we still don't have a good computational account of what are specifically the computations that our brains are doing as we learn schemas and as schemas guide behavior. And what we did in this review paper is we thought, okay, well, this is a very ubiquitous phenomena, happens all the time, very complex, very rich, that doesn't have a good computational account. Reinforcement learning is a computational theory of how people learn goal-appropriate behavior, how people learn what are the good behaviors that will let us reach our goal. And interestingly, in the recent decade or so, there has been a lot of studies that showed that in these two fields were kind of separated. But from both fields, both in the schema literature and in some of the like reinforcement learning literature, both of these literatures really realized that like the medial prefrontal cortex, which is just in the front of your brain, like inside, is a brain region that is really important for both. So we started that by saying like, okay, maybe there's a shared mechanism here. If it's the same brain region that is involved in both, maybe there's a shared mechanism here. And that kind of started our exploration of like, let's see, maybe they're similar. And that way, if so, then potentially reinforcement learning can be a computational account of how we learn schemas. In our research process of that, we realized that while it can tell a part of the story, we need some complementary algorithms to supplement. And that was really interesting. So first of all, schemas are thought to be hierarchical. For example, we have a schema of a restaurant that I mentioned, and this schema of a restaurant can be a part of our schema of the airport because there are restaurants in airports. Yeah. Right. It's very modular, and you can build like a hierarchical tree of that. Or like you can have a smaller one of a schema of, you know, how to salt your food.
Yeah.
And that can happen, that happens in restaurants sometimes, but that also happens when you have dinner at home.
Yeah.
So that also is like a sub little mini schema that can be a part of a bigger schema that then can be a part of even a bigger schema. So this hierarchical nature, there is literature in hierarchical reinforcement learning of how you do this sequencing and how you chunk schemas into sub-schemas or how you put together small pieces into a larger schema. Related to this chunking process, we also hypothesized that latent cause inference, the process that we talked about of how we chunk observations in the environment into a cluster, right? So now a schema can be such a cluster, right? So we also hypothesized that latent cause inference has a role in learning schemas as well. Another process that is really important, or we think is really important, is dimensionality reduction.
So can you explain what that means?
So when we build our model of the world or our schema, we don't represent each and everything. There are some dimensions that are important and others are not. So for example, when we enter a restaurant, we know to look for a host to show us where to sit, but we don't like particularly care the gender of the host or the color of the shirt. All of these things are, they're a part of your reality. They're just not important. And the process by which we learn what dimensions are important and what are not, like the price of a dish is important. But the colors of the maps on the table might not be. For some people, they might be. But some of the dimensions are important, others are not. To achieve our goals change, the dimensions can change as well. But this process of like learning what dimensions of our experience are important has been termed dimensionality reductions, because you reduce the dimensions of your experience and represent only the ones that are actually important for you to achieve your goal. Which sense. In the restaurant case is like, let's say, to have a lovely meal. These processes have been shown, like, for example, in categorization, they have been shown as complementary to like reinforcement learning. Because maybe one thing that I should say that I haven't mentioned earlier is that reinforcement learning, while it's very solid, like good computational account, the framework is very developed, it has a scaling problem, which means in a very complex environment, it starts to be intractable. The models cannot learn. And that's why, by the way, people have started to think about complementary mechanisms like hierarchical organization, which is a way to decompose tasks so that then each part of the task is manageable and then you just put them together. Or dimensionality reduction. If you don't represent all the dimensions in the environment, just a few of them, then it also reduces complexity. This scaling problem was a part of our motivation of why we kind of wanted to marry reinforcement learning and schemas. Because schemas are these like complex, rich events. So I was like, that could be a good example of how reinforcement learning scales up.
Yeah, that's really cool. And how does attention play into all of this?
Yeah, really great question. So one of the studies that have looked at dimensionality reduction within a reinforcement learning context have found that attention plays a big part in dimensionality reduction and in learning in a very interesting way. So what the underlying idea is that with experience, we learn what aspects of the environment are important for achieving our goal. In these experiments, it was to achieve higher reward, more money. So with time we learn, we pay more attention, meaning we learn more from experiences in that dimension. As well as there are brain systems that we know are involved in guiding attention that are involved in the task as well. And when you look at like where people look on the screen, they look like with eye tracking, they look more at the dimension that gives them reward in that task. So we both use attention to learn about which dimension gives us the most reward. And then when we learn it, we guide our attention towards that dimension.
Okay, so it's kind of like a loop.
It's a loop. And then with the relationship between schemas and attention, that also has a lot of research about it, showing how schemas really guide our attention and how, things that are, even let's think about like a psychology experiment that everybody in Psych 101 see. And I'm sorry, I don't want to like destroy people's experience, but like, do you know like the gorilla? There is it's a spoiler alert. But basically it's a few people playing a ball and you're meant to look at them and count how many passes they have. And you watch the video and you count and it's all great. And then you're being asked like, so how many columns? And you say like 7. Great. And apparently in the video, there was a man in a gorilla costume standing in the middle of the circle of the people passing the ball, doing a little dance, leaving the stage, and you haven't noticed it at all. Most people do not report seeing anything like it. They're like, did you notice anything weird? No. Nothing. Now, this is an example where, of course, there was a little bit of instruction, but the same thing happens also in our schema. Like, so many things we don't pay attention to, so many gorillas out there we don't see because we just don't expect them to be there, and our attention is somewhere else. And usually it's good. Let's say that you're driving and you're about to pass a junction and you look around because your schema of how to pass a junction tells you should look around to see if there are like passengers, and you see if there's someone about to cross the street, but you probably don't see someone who's like maybe a little bit down the line is not, and you're like, I have no idea who's there. And if there was a gorilla there, you probably would not see it at all. But that's a good thing, right? Because you were focusing on what the task told you to do. So this can be a way by which schemas guide our attention. One thing that we actually thought about as we wrote this review about schemas and reinforcement learning is that, we talked a lot about how reinforcement learning is goal-oriented and it's towards achieving a goal. But the way people think about schemas is that they are not only for goal-oriented behavior. So our schemas are a little bit broader than that, and they will include dimensions in the environment that repeat, even if they're irrelevant for your goals. Like, for example, in restaurants, mostly the cashier is at the bar, right? You never pay the cashier. Mostly the server you give them a credit card and stuff like that. But you knew that. It's absolutely goal irrelevant.
Okay, but it's something that...
But it repeats and it's there. And that we think of it as a part of our schema.
Okay.
And we're like, well, why would we know that? And the reason we think about it is because sometimes the environment changes and we want to be prepared. If now, like, they ask you, like, can you please go and pay the cashier, you will know where to go. You may not know where the kitchen is, right? But having a little bit of extra dimensions in case the environment changes could be a good thing. So we think our schemas include that as well.
It's very cool. And when you think about this stuff, how good we are at knowing how much we need to know.
And there's even like studies that are trying to understand what's like the optimal.
The optimal
dimensions.
So you have another study that looks at the role of the hippocampus in event segmentation. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So there we were really interested in how, we talked about event segmentation. We talked about how we want to really chunk events based on context. And we thought, okay, well, there are a few challenges there, right? At that time when I started the study, a lot of the literature was about novel events, things you experience once. But I'm really interested in, as we talked about schemas, how do we build these schemas over repetition? So what happens when events repeat? And we thought, okay, well, as we repeat events more and more, even though the opportunity is there, it's really not that adaptive. Like, you want to integrate events because that allows us to predict better. Like, if your memories are integrated one with another, they're similar, it's easier to predict from one to another. So, like, if you really integrate well the memory of like, oh, there is a host, I'm asking them, sitting at the table, then you can already like predict the steps, and that helps you to prepare, and that's good. But you don't want to predict all the way to the future. Like, when you enter the restaurant, it needs to stop at some point. It's not adaptive to predict like, oh, and then I'll leave the restaurant and we go back home and like I need to take Subway 6. Like, that doesn't make sense. So we're like, okay, how do we integrate but based on context in an adaptive way? And the second question we thought about was, well, this is done by making memories similar. But at the same time, we also want to keep memories distinct so we remember the details, right? Because if everything is integrated and becomes similar, then we lose the details. We lose the like little subtleties of what actually happened there. And we need another mechanism there. So we looked at the hippocampus because in the hippocampus, there are different subregions and they mediate different functions of integrating memories versus separating memories. So in the hippocampus, there are many subregions. I'll mention only the ones that are relevant for today. So CA3 is thought to be like really important for integration.
Mm-hmm.
CA3 neurons are really interconnected between themselves, and this is thought to promote integrated memories because like you get a cue for a memory. So you enter the restaurant, you see the host, because the neurons are interconnected, the full event memory is then reinstated or activated. This has been thought of in CA3 or has been modeled as attractor dynamics. So because the neurons are interconnected, many similar experiences can be attracted to the same activity pattern, to the same memory representation, and they become even more similar because all the neurons are really connected. Whereas different experiences are attracted towards different activity patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So we thought, well, maybe CA3 integrates events based on context, so that similar experiences that are all in the same context, so they're similar, they share the same context, are all becoming even more similar. Mm-hmm. Whereas experiences in different contexts, they become separated. They're attracted to different representations. Mm-hmm. Great. So this is how we integrate event. But then remember the part of like creating still very distinct memories of what happened in the event. Like, how do we do that? Different subregion of the hippocampus, dentate gyrus, short DG. This is thought to be like a separation powerhouse of the hippocampus. This is a region that neurons in this region fire very sparsely. And this was thought to promote pattern separation. So the allocation of distinct representations to similar inputs. Mm-hmm. So all of these sub-event things, like exactly what I said, was the food good or not? All of these things we thought could be represented in the DG very separately. The way we thought about it is that maybe on top of like CA3 integrated event representations, DG performs pattern separation and create distinct representation of these details so we can later remember them. Mm-hmm. So we did a study in which people learned lists of events, and the way we did this study, and that has been done a lot before, was creating events by changing a background color. So people would see just a list of black and white objects appearing one after the other, and the objects were superimposed on a background color. So every 4 objects, we would change the background color. Mm-hmm. So for example, you would see 4 objects and they would all be like with an orange background, and that's like the orange event. Yeah. And then the color changes. And this change of color creates a shift of context or an event boundary, and then there would be like a blue event. Yeah. And then we repeated them because I remember I wanted to see what happens as events repeat. And what we found was that indeed, as people were learning and as learning progressed, when we look at the end of learning, in CA3, events became integrated based on context. So objects that appeared in the same event with all of the ones with the orange background, mm-hmm. they're all represented similarly, but different from the ones in the blue event.
Okay.
So this is a way by which we think CA3 might integrate event memories. All of the things within event are more similar to each other. And that can be really good, for example, for like predicting what will come next, or for learning context appropriate behavior. Like, what are the things you do in a restaurant? What are the things you don't do?
Yeah.
You don't do in a restaurant. That's a part of like a different event. And additionally, when we look at the dentate gyrus, the separation powerhouse, we see there that indeed objects that appeared in the same event became more separated, more distinct from one another. So okay. The opposite almost of CA3. And it was even more specific than that. It was only those that appear close in time.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah. So that was really like crazy. We're like, it's really just the ones that are the most similar, both the perceptual information, like the background color, yeah. and the temporal information. They were like close in time,
yeah.
so presumably sharing the most similar temporal information.
Mm-hmm.
Those that are farther apart in time,
yeah.
or that are in different events, we think they are probably different enough in their cortical representation already, yeah. so that DG doesn't need to do this like extra separation boost.
Do you think that this kind of activity, I guess this was just all in a healthy cohort.
This is all healthy, yeah.
Would this be different in some people with anxiety?
It could be. Yeah, it's such a great question. So in CA3, we also saw that the more CA3 clustered or integrated as events, the easier it was for people to transition between events. Like if you have a very clear separation between events, it's easier to transition. You remember that I spoke about this like longer reaction time that people have for boundaries? When people separated well, this got quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So it still takes longer, but less so. You have less of a cost because we think the representations are very clear. It's easy to shift.
Yeah.
One thing that, can happen potentially, and we don't know, is that these representations change in some way in people with anxiety that influence how long it takes them to process these boundaries.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. But this is future research.
TBD.
Question. Yeah. Get back in for the next podcast. Next week. We'll have it.
So I found this episode, as all of them, very interesting, but I did feel out of my depths as a social psych researcher. But first of all, Oded did an incredible job at explaining this research, and even as an outsider who doesn't know a lot about how this works, I found thinking about schemas and thinking about segmenting really interesting. And so when I was thinking about this idea of this context shift, I was thinking you and I have actually had big context shifts in our lives, which is like we've moved countries. So I was just thinking, like, do you think that had an impact on your memory? Do you think that had an impact on how you came into situations? Like, do you feel that, because I feel like a lot of the times when we think about schemas, as Oded mentioned, which is maybe a little bit different than the idea of schemas in this more constrained idea of memory in specific context, but we think about these schemas that we bring in with us across the lifespan. But then it was like this idea that context shifts things so much. So do you feel like when you moved, do you feel like you had this big change in context, or do you feel like you were still bringing in a lot of things from where you lived in the past and other experiences?
That is so interesting, because just then, when you were asking that, I was thinking every memory I have in my context of the country, it's very clear where I was. So I don't have any memories that it's like, did that happen in Melbourne or Amsterdam or New York? It's always so clear where each thing took place. And I've had friends who I've seen you in multiple places, I've seen friends in multiple places, but I'll always know. And I wonder if that overarching schema for that place is really strong in terms of how that's organized in my memory.
I feel like you have a strong schema for our time in the Netherlands, for sure.
Strong schema.
I do feel that, this is obviously zooming out a lot from Oded's work, but I feel like there is this idea of these big context shifts, especially if you're moving like we have for a job or for a program or something. That context is so intense and it really colors everything around your experience. And I feel that there was a dark cloud over all the things you experienced in the Netherlands. Not solely because of the Netherlands, but because of the time in your life.
No, I think that that's true. And I also think every time I go back to New York, I know I'm a bit different because I know how to, the schema I guess I have for that place is different to how I am in Melbourne. I was just telling Ava, I feel so ingrained in Melbourne at the moment. I kind of struggled this time in New York to get back into New York hustle energy because I think, my schema, it could be something like that. Yeah, I don't know if you've had this experience too.
If you have like sticky
schemas.
Yeah, I don't know, because I think obviously when you move, it's like such a big deal and it's so intense. But maybe actually if you're moving in a way that coincides with other big life shifts, like a new job or maybe ending a relationship, then maybe actually that like huge context shift also helps you readjust faster in a way where maybe you wouldn't if you were like still in the same city or still in the same place and you didn't have as big of a cue. Because I do feel like then you kind of get to start over in a way. Totally. But then if you're just like coming back and you're in the bath of your schema of Melbourne and then you're put into New York again, then maybe that's jarring because you're not expecting to shift as much.
Yeah, because before I spoke to Oded, I had never thought about this before. I guess I just thought everything was continuous, and obviously, but just the fact that we have this is a new context, so this memory. And then when I don't know, if you think about your memories and you go back to them, they are all very much like that. You don't have this memory of this continuous move from one thing to the next. They're in these little clumps. I don't know if your memory's like that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because Also, in another aspect of thinking about this, cross-culturally, there's a lot of evidence that people's views of themselves kind of shift depending on the context that you're in, but like cross-culturally, people do that more or less. So it's interesting that you say that like you feel that you have really strong memories that are clumped together, because there is evidence that people who are from more collectivistic cultures, that they tend to shift who they are more variably. And it's really normal for people who are more collectivistic to change completely from work to home to being with their best friends. Whereas in individualistic cultures, there's a more strong sense of self. But with Oded talking at some points about how the self is this continuous thing that you can kind of like take with you in every context, and that can be your context, I kind of wonder like how that also shifts in different cultures where maybe people actually don't feel as strong a sense of continuous self.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you feel like things change pretty fast for you as well.
Yeah, I wonder, if segmentation, I guess it would be different in different cultures.
But just depends maybe like how strong you're segmenting things. And I mean, Oded talked about these hierarchical arrangements of different algorithms and way things are implemented. And maybe there's just like a stronger boundary for certain things. But I wonder if that is differentially also represented neurally. Like in the West, are memories of yourself in a context where you're with your friends and you behaved in a certain way, is that representation more similar in certain brain regions than it would be if it was someone from a collectivistic culture who sees themselves as more different and that context is more different?
Yeah. How do you feel?
I don't know. I feel that I actually have, well, this is maybe a little different, but you know how some people feel like they're a completely different person than they were?
Yeah.
I don't feel like that at all. I feel like I have a super, super strong sense of continuation of like, I was the same person when I was 17.
No segmentation.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's segmentation, but it seems like probably some kind of a different process. But I have a strong sense of, I feel that I've always been the same person. Like I feel a strong sense of continuation with myself in the past, but I also feel extremely variable from one context to another.
And do you feel like you have a different schema for Santa Barbara compared to Amsterdam compared to Toronto? And do you feel different in those places?
Yeah, but I don't know if those count as schemas.
Yeah.
I'm sure Oded will listen to this and be like, that's not a schema. But I think like definitely like the way that you interact with people and maybe like a schema for, I don't know if this exists, but how your week is going to go and how you're going to interact with your friends. Because I feel like in Santa Barbara, it's going on a hike and like seeing your friends during the day, having dinner. And then in Amsterdam, I feel like, and maybe this was an artifact of being younger as well, but it was a lot more of like, oh, we're supposed to go to a bar. We're supposed to do this. We're supposed to go to the techno warehouse and go take the ferry and be rained on for 7 hours. And if you don't want to do that, what's wrong with you? So I do think that there is a big context shift in terms of that.
Yeah, and it's funny because so this time in Santa Barbara, I found it really easy to be here and like, oh, this is really comfortable and I know exactly what to do. And I think maybe because I've been in Melbourne longer and like it's kind of a similar
schema.
Yeah, I really, yeah. And then New York this time I was like, oh my God, there's so much going on. I need to lay down. Whereas Santa Barbara, you can do a lot of laying down.
We did watch Love is Blind for 3 hours last night.
Just laying down, yeah.
So the Melbourne and Santa Barbara schemas are
similar, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if schemas can count as but it does, when we're talking about schemas, we're also talking more just about like your general orientations and expectations for your life.
But I think that kind of would be
the biggest cluster
like
hierarchy thing.
I think everything would be
a schema.
Yeah,
you think everything's a schema?
Schemas all the way down.
Oh wow, hot take.
No, I don't know if I really believe it. Well, to finish, would you like to give us some tips for learning and memory? How to improve learning and memory?
I love that part. It's the best part. So first of all, and it's all going to be things that are related to what we talked about today. The first thing is that I can say it's based on my research, but not only, of course, a lot of people's research, relating things to prior knowledge. So we remember things better if we make connections and relate them to our prior knowledge. One really good thing to relate information to, if you want to learn a new one, is ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's for two reasons. First of all, we have a very good prior knowledge of ourselves. Like we know ourselves pretty good. We have a really good schema, right? The self is a really good, developed, rich schema. The other reason is actually that one thing that is really important for memory and really helps memory is similarity in the context between encoding and retrieval. You go to your kitchen sometime and you're like, oh, why did I come here?
Yeah.
Forget. And then you go back to the room where you've been before. That is because context is really powerful. And it's like the same context during encoding where you had the thought to begin with can help you remember that. Now, how is that related to the self? Whenever we need to remember something, we are always there.
Yeah.
So ourselves is a really good context.
Yeah.
That is always there, both during encoding and during retrieval. So relating things to ourselves helps both because of like relating to prior knowledge and because of context similarity. Cramming.
Yeah.
Cramming sucks.
Yeah.
So we don't call it cramming sucks. That's not the technical term. But there's a lot of research about spaced versus mass learning. So mass learning is what many of us do before a test. We just like do mass learning, learn everything in like short time. It might help with a test. It's not a good strategy for the long term. Spaced learning is better. So learning and then, getting back to it after and learning again. And one of the reasons that people think why it's better is because when you space learning, you actually learn the same thing in different contexts. So you have more roads to get to that memory.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, so space learning.
Yeah.
Different contexts. Then the last thing that I wanted to say is creating meaning in any way. And that's a part of like relating things to prior knowledge, but like telling a story. We were talking about segmentation, a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end about something. Like our brain is really good with creating meaningful stuff. Like why do we all bad in remembering names? Because names are arbitrary. And our brain is not really into learning these things. Like it's really tuned into learning things that are meaningful, not arbitrary, because arbitrary things are mostly useless.
Yeah.
So creating meaning by creating story, by relating it to yourself, by relating it to prior knowledge, all of these things are really helpful in creating durable memories.
Thank you to Dr. Oded Bein for joining us this episode. Our intro and outro music is Nobody Stayed for the DJ by Glacio. Our transition music is Back for More, also by Glacio. Minds Matter is mixed, edited, and created by Beth Fisher, she's the Australian one, and me, Ava D'Souza. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode, but in the meantime, find all our episodes and show notes on mindsmatterpodcast.com.